The attic floorboards were a poor shield against the world. Sarah knew this. She knew the way her father's booming pronouncements on the price of wool could travel through the lath and plaster, the way the housekeeper's scolding of a kitchen maid could rise like steam through the cracks. But sound was a small price for solitude. Here, amongst the ghosts of furniture and shrouded portraits, she was not Sarah Prescott, 20 years of age, spinster, and asset to be liquidated. She was simply a girl in a dusty dress, sitting on a trunk filled with her mother's trousseau linens, reading letters written in a faded, elegant hand. And for the first time in a week, she was laughing. It was not a loud laugh, but a soft, breathless cascade of mirth that shook her shoulders. Her mother, it turned out, had been a terrible poet in her youth. The odes to garden snails and mournful sonnets about misplaced gloves were so earnest, so wonderfully awful, that Sarah had to press her palm to her mouth to contain the sound. She imagined her mother, a girl her own age, chewing the end of a quill and believing with all her heart in the tragic beauty of a wilting petunia. The thought was a small, warm sun in the cold cavern of her life. She was so lost in the image, in the quiet joy of it, that she did not hear the parlor door open below, nor the heavy, measured footsteps that crossed the Aubusson carpet. She did not hear her father's sputtering apologies, nor the guest's low murmur of dismissal. She only became aware of the silence when it had stretched for a full minute, thick and expectant. She held her breath, listening. Nothing. The guest must have departed. She waited another 10 minutes, the letters resting in her lap, before carefully rising. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from the gabled window. She descended the narrow attic stairs, her hand trailing along the cool, rough wall, emerging into the quiet of the upper hall. The house felt empty, settled. Her father had likely retired to his study with a bottle of brandy to celebrate his successful transaction. She smoothed her gray wool skirt and walked down the main staircase, her steps making no sound on the worn runner. The parlor door was ajar. A single lamp was lit, casting long shadows that writhed like living things, and in the center of the room, standing before the cold hearth, was a man. He was not her father. He was tall, dressed in severe black broadcloth that seemed to absorb the light, and he was watching the doorway as if he had known she would appear in it at precisely this moment. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his jaw set, his eyes a startling pale gray that seemed to assess her down to the bone. This was the Duke of Mournfield. The name was a whispered legend in the county, a man of immense wealth and immense solitude, who had not been seen in society for a decade. "Miss Prescott," he said. His voice was not loud, but it filled the room, a low baritone with the cold, clear ring of a bell struck in winter. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without having to raise it. Sarah's breath caught. She could only stare, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "You have a pleasant laugh," the Duke of Mournfield continued, his expression unreadable, a mask of aristocratic indifference. "It carries." He took a step forward, and it was all Sarah could do not to take a step back. The air crackled with a tension she did not understand. He held all the power in the room. She was a trespasser in her own home. He stopped a few feet from her. "Your father and I have concluded our business. The arrangement is made." He paused, and his gray eyes held hers, unwavering. "I came to hear the asset for myself." The words hung in the air, cold and precise. He had not been listening to her. He had been auditing her. The laughter, Her one private moment of joy had been an audition. The door to her old life did not simply close. It was locked and bolted from the other side, and the man holding the key was a stranger who had purchased her, sight unseen, sound unheard, until now. We hope this story finds you well. If you enjoy tales of quiet strength and unexpected love, please consider subscribing for more. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far these stories travel. Now, let us return to the life that brought Sarah to this moment. Her life at Alderton Manor had been a long lesson in making oneself small. Her father, Baron Prescott, was a man whose ambitions had always outstripped his resources, leaving a wake of unpaid vintners, disgruntled tenants, and mortgaged fields. Sarah, with her mother's mind for figures and a quiet, methodical nature, had been the invisible engine that kept the estate from crumbling entirely. From the age of 16, she had managed the household ledgers, renegotiating with suppliers, stretching shillings into pounds, and ensuring the staff were paid even when her father was ordering another case of French claret he could not afford. Her work was never acknowledged. It was simply expected, a daughter's duty, as unremarkable as darning socks. Her father saw her not as a manager, but as a line item in his accounts, an asset whose value would one day be realized on the marriage market. The cruelty was not in blows, but in 1,000 daily dismissals. It was in the way he would listen to her careful explanation of the crop rotation plan, nod, and then present it to the steward as his own idea. It was in the way he would praise her needlework, but never her mind. Her older brother, Thomas, had inherited his father's casual disregard, treating her as a fixture of the house, useful but uninteresting, like a well-placed hat stand. Their dinners were exercises in polite suffocation. "Sarah, do try to look a little less severe," her father would say, gesturing with his wineglass. "A sour face will not attract a suitable husband." A suitable husband was the constant refrain, the answer to all their problems. For a brief, hopeful season, it had seemed Sir Reginald Croft might be that man. He was handsome, charming, and paid her attentions that felt, for a time, genuine. He spoke to her of books, not just bonnets, and listened when she spoke of the challenges of managing the estate. Sarah had allowed a small, fragile bud of hope to grow. The bud was crushed the day she overheard him speaking to her father in the study. "The dowry is simply insufficient, Baron," Sir Reginald had said, his charming voice laced with cold steel. £500 will not cover my debts, let alone maintain my station. Her face is pleasant enough, but it is not a face worth a lifetime of penury." Her father had blustered, but the engagement was quietly dissolved the following week. Sir Reginald had not even done her the courtesy of saying goodbye. That was the betrayal that had sent her retreating to the attic, to the company of ghosts and letters. It was a physical space that mirrored her internal one, a place to store things that were no longer wanted, but too precious to discard entirely. Her one ally in the house was Eliza, a maid near her own age who had been with the family since they were both children. Eliza saw everything. She saw the way Sarah's careful budgets were ignored, the way her ideas were stolen. She would leave a hot cup of tea for Sarah in the study late at night, a silent offering of solidarity. "He doesn't deserve you, miss," Eliza had whispered once, after finding Sarah weeping quietly in the linen closet following the incident with Sir Reginald. "None of them do." And Sarah knew she was right, but knowing and escaping were two very different things. Her world was a cage, gilded with propriety but with bars of iron. The night the Duke arrived, her father had been in a state of high agitation for days. A final, unpayable debt had been called in. Ruin was no longer a distant threat. It was a guest expected for dinner. "We are entertaining a gentleman of great importance tonight, Sarah," he had announced at breakfast. "He is a potential investor. I expect you to be presentable. Wear the blue silk." Sarah knew what investor meant. It meant she was the investment. The thought of another interview, another assessment by a man who would weigh her breeding against his debts, was more than she could bear. So she had pleaded a headache, a time-honored excuse, and fled to the attic with her mother's letters, seeking a few hours of peace before the next battle. She had not known the ceiling was so thin. She had not known the guest was a duke, and she had not known that the one genuine, uncalculated sound she had made in years would be the very thing that sealed her fate. The journey to Mournfield was conducted in near total silence. The Duke's carriage was as severe and unadorned as his clothing, black lacquer and dark gray upholstery, sprung so perfectly that it glided over the rutted country roads with an unnerving smoothness. It was a cage of a different sort, silent, efficient, and inescapable. Sarah sat opposite him, her hands folded in the lap of her plain traveling dress, which Eliza had packed in a single trunk, along with her few books and her mother's letters. The Duke had not spoken a word since they had left Alderton Manor, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape of skeletal winter trees and damp, fallow fields. He did not read. He did not fidget. He simply sat, a study in controlled stillness, his presence a weight in the small space. Sarah watched him from under her lashes, cataloging the details, the fine lines around his eyes, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the way his long fingers rested, perfectly still, on his knee. He was not a handsome man in the way Sir Reginald had been. His features were too harsh, his expression too remote. But there was a power in his stillness that was more formidable than any practiced charm. They arrived at Mournfield as dusk was bleeding into night. The estate was not visible from the road. They passed through a massive stone gatehouse, unmanned, and traveled for another mile down a drive lined with ancient, gnarled oaks. The house appeared suddenly, a vast, Gothic pile of gray stone and leaded glass, its crenellated towers clawing at the bruised twilight sky. It was less a home than a fortress, built to keep the world at bay. A groom took the horses, and the massive front door swung open before they reached it, spilling a rectangle of pale yellow light onto the gravel. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, ramrod straight, her silver hair pulled into a severe knot. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "Mrs. Gable," the Duke acknowledged, his tone as flat as her own. "This is Miss Prescott. She will be the new Duchess. See that she is made comfortable." Mrs. Gable's eyes, small and sharp as a bird's, flickered over Sarah, taking in her simple dress, her unadorned hair, her lack of a lady's maid. It was not a welcoming gaze. It was an inventory. Sarah felt herself being measured and found wanting. The Duke led her into a cavernous great hall. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, but it did little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the stone walls. The air smelled of beeswax, old wood, and cold stone. "We will speak in my study," he said, and it was not a request. He led her down a long, paneled corridor to a room lined from floor to ceiling with books. Here, the fire was smaller, the room warmer. He gestured for her to sit in a leather wingback chair and remained standing himself, his back to the fire. This was where the terms would be stated. "Miss Prescott," he began, his voice calm and methodical, as if he were discussing crop yields. "Let us be clear about the nature of our arrangement. I require a duchess. I require an heir and a woman to manage this household, which has been without a mistress for too long. You, I am told, have a mind for such things." He paused. "In return, I will provide you with a title, a home, and absolute financial security. Your father's debts are settled. He will not trouble you again. You will have your own rooms, your own accounts, and as much independence as the walls of this estate can provide." He met her eyes, his own as cool and clear as glass. "What I will not provide is affection. I do not offer companionship, nor will I feign a love I do not feel. This is a contract, a partnership of mutual convenience. Are the terms acceptable?" Sarah looked at the man before her. He was offering her a prison, but an honest one. Its walls were stone, not suffocating politeness. Its warden was cold, but he was not cruel. He had not lied to her. Cold indifference was survivable. Active, smiling cruelty, the kind practiced by her father and Sir Reginald, was a slow poison. This was an antidote. "The terms are acceptable, Your Grace," she said, her voice steady. He gave a single sharp nod, as if a price had been agreed upon. "Very well. We will be married by special license on Friday. Mrs. Gable will show you to your rooms." He turned back to the fire, a clear dismissal. The contract had been made. Sarah rose and followed the housekeeper's rigid back out of the study, the silence of Mournfield Manor closing in around her. It was a cold, empty world, but for the first time in her life, it was a world where the rules had been stated plainly. In the days that followed, Sarah learned the rhythms of her new cage. Mournfield was a place of profound silence, broken only by the ticking of clocks and the distant ghostly movements of a skeleton staff. The servants moved like wraiths through the long corridors, their faces impassive, their loyalty clearly belonging to the Duke and his formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. Sarah was assigned a suite of rooms in the East Wing, a sitting room, a bedroom, and a dressing room, all furnished with heavy, dark wood furniture and faded tapestries. They were grand, cold, and impersonal. A young maid named Mary was assigned to her, a quiet girl with wide, watchful eyes who seemed terrified of speaking out of turn. The wedding was as the Duke had promised, a swift, impersonal affair conducted by a local vicar in the estate's private chapel. The only witnesses were Mrs. Gable and the Duke's steward, a grim-faced man named Fletcher. Alistair, the Duke, spoke his vows in the same dispassionate tone he had used to state their contract. Sarah spoke hers in a clear, steady voice. A plain gold band was placed on her finger. She was now the Duchess of Mournfield, and nothing had changed. Her husband retreated to his study or his own wing of the house, and she was left to the vast, echoing silence. But Sarah was not a woman who could abide idleness. She had managed a crumbling estate on a shoestring budget. She could not sit and do needlepoint in a house that, for all its grandeur, felt neglected. She began to work. She requested the household accounts from a reluctant Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper presented them with a sniff, as if to say this was no business of a lady's. Sarah spent a week at the desk in her sitting room, poring over the ledgers. The Duke was wealthy, but his household was being bled dry by wasteful contracts and inefficient suppliers. She saw it instantly. She began by writing a letter to the London merchant who supplied their tea, renegotiating the price based on bulk purchase, a tactic that saved the estate nearly £30 a year. She moved on to the butcher, the chandler, the wine merchant. She did not ask permission. She simply did it, presenting the new contracts to Mr. Fletcher, the steward, whose expression of disbelief slowly morphed into one of grudging respect. Then she turned her attention to the house itself. The vast gardens were a ruin of overgrown rose bushes and choked pathways. She found an elderly groundskeeper named Peterson, who spent his days sadly pottering in a small greenhouse. Together, they began the slow work of reclamation. Sarah put on a pair of old leather gloves and worked alongside him, pulling weeds, pruning back the dead wood, her hands sinking into the cold, honest soil. It was grounding work. It was real. She discovered the west wing was closed entirely, the furniture draped in white cloths, the air thick with the dust of years. Mary, the maid, whispered that it had been the wing of the first Duchess, and that no one had entered it since her death a decade ago. It was the Duke's one inviolable rule. Sarah respected it, a silent acknowledgement of a wound she did not need to understand to see. Her husband watched her. She would feel his eyes on her from a distant window as she worked in the garden. She would look up from the ledgers in the library late at night to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, before he would give a slight nod and retreat. They took breakfast together in a small, sunless dining room, the table long enough for 20. They would sit at opposite ends, the length of polished mahogany a chasm between them. The conversations were brief, transactional. "The new contract with the miller is more favorable," she would report. "Good," he would reply, and that would be all. But slowly, something was shifting. The staff's attitude, led by Mrs. Gable, thawed from suspicion to a cautious respect. Mary began to speak to her, offering small observations about the house, a shy smile. The library became a shared space. Often she would enter late at night to find him there, reading by the fire. He would look up, nod, and return to his book. They would sit in silence for hours, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the turning of pages. It was not companionship, but it was a form of coexistence, a quiet truce. One evening, she found a book left on the table beside her usual chair, a treatise on Italian garden design. There was no note, but she knew it was from him. It was the first gesture that was not part of their contract, a small, quiet crack in the fortress wall. The library was Sarah's sanctuary. It was the one room at Mournfield that felt truly alive, warmed by a constant fire and the silent, waiting company of 1,000 books. It was there, in the 3rd month of her marriage, that she made the discovery that threatened to shatter the fragile peace she had built. Alistair had given her leave to organize the estate archives, which were housed in a series of locked cabinets at the far end of the room. He had given her the key with a simple instruction: put them in order. Fletcher is a sentimentalist. He keeps everything. For weeks, she worked her way through brittle leases, tenant records, and correspondence stretching back 2 centuries. It was methodical, satisfying work. It was in a thick, leather-bound folder labeled Prescott Debts that she found it. Her breath hitched. Inside were not just records of her father's mortgages and loans, but a series of letters between the Duke of Mournfield and his London solicitor, dated from the month before their marriage. The solicitor's letters were deferential, outlining the process of acquiring Baron Prescott's outstanding debts from a dozen different creditors. The Duke's replies were clipped, precise, and chilling. "Acquire them all," one note read. "The price is immaterial. I want total leverage." Another, dated a week before his visit to Alderton, was even more stark. "The reports on the daughter are satisfactory. Her management of that failing estate indicates a practical mind. Proceed. I will visit the property myself to confirm my assessment." Sarah sat back in her chair, the letters clutched in her hand, the paper cold against her skin. A wave of ice washed through her. This was not a random business arrangement. He had not simply been a convenient, wealthy suitor her father had found. He had targeted her, He had systematically bought her father's ruin to purchase her, his future duchess, as one might purchase a promising broodmare, complete with a satisfactory report on her temperament and skills. The laughter he had claimed to find so pleasant, it hadn't been a discovery. It had been a final confirmation. The cold, transactional nature of their agreement suddenly felt like a lie. It wasn't a transaction. It was an acquisition. Every act of competence she had demonstrated, every ledger she had balanced, every contract she had renegotiated, felt like a performance for an unseen audience, a justification of his investment. A hot, bitter anger rose in her throat. She had prized his honesty, the stark clarity of their contract. But this was a deception of omission, a manipulation so profound it unmade the very foundation of their arrangement. She waited for him that night. She did not light the lamps in the library, sitting in the dark with the folder on her lap, the fire casting flickering, monstrous shadows on the walls. He entered just after 10, as was his custom. "Sarah," he said, his voice holding a note of surprise at finding her in the darkness. She struck a lucifer and lit the lamp on the table beside her. The sudden light made him blink. Her face, she knew, was a pale, hard mask. "We need to speak," she said, her voice low and tight. He saw the folder on her lap, and for the first time since she had met him, his composure fractured. A flicker of something, regret, apprehension, crossed his features before being suppressed. He closed the door behind him and walked slowly toward her. "You found the Prescott file," he said. It was not a question. "I found evidence of a calculated purchase," she corrected him, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed fury. "You told me this was a marriage of convenience. You failed to mention that you engineered the inconvenience. You bought my father's downfall to force his hand. You bought me." He did not deny it. He simply stood before her, his face in shadow. "Yes," he said, the word dropping into the silence like a stone. "Why?" The word was a raw whisper. He was silent for a long moment. "My first wife," he began, his voice strained, "was the toast of London. Beautiful, charming, celebrated. She was also a liar and an adulteress, who ran my family name through the mud and nearly bankrupted this estate with her debts and deceits. She taught me the worthlessness of charm. She taught me that the world values the wrong things." He looked at Sarah, and in the lamplight she saw the profound, ancient weariness in his eyes. "I swore I would never again bring a woman to this house who was not her opposite. I needed a partner, not a peacock. I made inquiries. I heard of a baron's daughter who ran her father's estate with quiet brilliance while he drove it into the ground. A woman of substance, ignored by a world that could not see her value. So yes, I engineered it. It was the only way I could see to secure the one thing I now value above all others: competence, honesty." He had answered. It was not a perfect answer, not one that erased the manipulation, but it was the truth. It was a piece of his broken past, offered up as an explanation. The anger in her chest did not vanish, but it was joined by a new, complicated emotion. He had not bought her as an object. He had sought her out for the very qualities no one else had ever seen. The fragile truce established by Alistair's confession was tested less than a fortnight later. A carriage, far too glossy and ostentatious for the country roads, crunched up the gravel drive one afternoon. Sarah was arranging late-blooming roses in the great hall when the butler, with a look of profound disapproval, announced the arrival of Sir Reginald Croft. The name was a jolt, a ghost from a life she had thought left behind. Sir Reginald strode into the hall as if he owned it, his smile as polished and insincere as ever. "Sarah, my dear," he exclaimed, advancing on her with his hands outstretched. "I was so terribly worried. When I heard you had been spirited away by the reclusive Duke of Mournfield, I feared the worst. I came at once to ensure you were, well." His eyes swept the hall, taking in the tapestries, the scale of the fireplace, the glint of silver from a distant room. It was not concern in his eyes, it was avarice. He was assessing the prize he had let slip through his fingers. "I am quite well, Sir Reginald," Sarah said, her voice colder than the stone floors. She did not take his hands. "Your concern is unnecessary, and your visit is unwelcome." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "My dear, you are overwrought. It is understandable. This is a grim place, and the Duke's reputation is formidable. You need not keep up appearances for me. If you are unhappy, if you are being held here against your will, I will help you." He was framing his intrusion as a rescue, casting himself as the hero and her as the damsel. He was playing a scene for the servants, who were hovering in the doorways, their expressions carefully neutral. Before Sarah could deliver the sharp retort that was forming on her tongue, a low voice spoke from the top of the grand staircase. "My wife is not being held against her will." Alistair stood there, dressed in a simple black coat, his presence commanding the vast space. He descended the stairs slowly, his eyes fixed on Sir Reginald with an expression of lethal contempt. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "She is the Duchess of Mournfield, and you, sir, are trespassing." Sir Reginald, to his credit, did not immediately quail. He drew himself up, the picture of offended chivalry. "Your Grace, I am an old friend of Sarah's. I came out of concern for her welfare." "Your concern," Alistair said, stopping on the last step, his height giving him a distinct advantage, "is a commodity you sell to the highest bidder, and your credit here has expired." The insult was so precise, so cutting, that a flush crept up Sir Reginald's neck. He knew that the Duke knew everything about his jilting of Sarah, about his fortune hunting. Sarah felt a surge of something fierce and protective. This was her house. This was her husband. This was her battle. She stepped forward, positioning herself slightly in front of Alistair, a small but significant shift. She was not a prize to be fought over. "Sir Reginald," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the hall's acoustics, "let me be perfectly plain, so there is no room for misunderstanding. You dismissed me when you believed me to be penniless. Now that my station has changed, you appear with manufactured concern. You are not a friend. You are a speculator. My husband has named you correctly. Now you will leave my home." The authority in her voice was new, forged in the quiet competence of the past months. It was the voice of the Duchess of Mournfield. Sir Reginald stared at her, his mask of charm finally cracking to reveal the petty, grasping man beneath. He saw not a frightened girl, but a woman of power, allied with a man who could ruin him with a word. He looked from her cold, determined face to the Duke's implacable one. They were a wall he could not breach. He gave a stiff, jerky bow. "As you wish, Your Grace," he muttered, the title a sour grape in his mouth. He turned on his heel and walked out, the great oak door closing behind him with a definitive thud. Silence descended on the hall. Sarah stood her ground, her heart hammering. Alistair came down the final step and stood beside her. He did not touch her, but she could feel the warmth of him, the solid, steady presence. They were not savior and rescued. They were allies, standing together against a common threat. He looked down at her, and his severe expression had softened into something she could not name, something akin to wonder. "Well spoken, Duchess," he said, his voice quiet, meant only for her. That night, the library was not a space of quiet coexistence. It was a room charged with the unspoken aftermath of the afternoon's confrontation. Sarah sat by the fire, a book open in her lap, but she had not turned a page in an hour. She was replaying the scene in the hall, the feeling of Alistair's presence at her back, the surprising strength she had found in her own voice. It was one thing to balance ledgers and restore gardens. It was another to face down the man who represented all the humiliation of her past and emerge victorious. She felt changed, stronger. Alistair entered the room and, instead of taking his usual chair across the hearth, he came and stood near her, leaning an arm on the mantelpiece. The firelight caught the sharp planes of his face, softening the harsh lines. For a long time he was silent, watching the flames. "He was a fool," Alistair said at last, his voice a low rumble. "To see you only as a dowry. To look at you and not see everything else." Sarah looked up at him. The air between them was thick with things unsaid, with the slow, patient accumulation of shared silences, of breakfasts across a long table, of books left as quiet offerings. He had seen her, from the very beginning, through the cold calculus of his acquisition. He had seen the person she was, not the commodity her father and Sir Reginald had tried to make her. "You were formidable today," he continued, turning his gaze from the fire to her. "I have never seen anyone dismiss a man so thoroughly with so few words." "I learned to be economical at Alderton," she said, a small, wry smile touching her lips. "Words were a luxury I could not afford to waste." He did not smile back, but the intensity in his gray eyes deepened. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, and also as if he had been seeing her forever. The silence that fell between them now was different. It was not empty. It was full. It held the weight of his confession about his first wife, of her discovery of his scheme, of their shared victory over Sir Reginald. It held the quiet respect that had grown between them, sturdy and tenacious as the roses she had coaxed back to life in the neglected garden. "Sarah," he said, and the use of her given name, so rare from his lips, was startling in its intimacy. He pushed himself away from the mantel and took a step closer. He knelt before her chair, an astonishing gesture of vulnerability from a man so guarded. He took the book from her lap and set it aside, and then he took her hand. His fingers were warm and strong, and they curled around hers, a firm, possessive, and yet gentle hold. "The sound of your laughter through the floorboards," he said, his voice quiet, almost rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "It was the first honest thing I had heard in a decade. I thought I was acquiring a competent manager for my estate." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, his gaze unwavering. "I find I am unwilling to live without it." It was not a declaration of love in the poetic sense. There were no flourishes, no grand pronouncements. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same grave certainty he used to discuss crop prices or legal matters. It was the most devastatingly romantic thing she had ever heard. It was the truth, plain and unadorned. It was the wall of his solitude, of his pain, of his mistrust, coming down brick by quiet brick. He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. And in that simple, reverent gesture, every term of their cold contract was rendered null and void. replaced by a new agreement, unspoken but perfectly understood. The Duchess of Northumberland's annual masquerade ball was the undisputed pinnacle of the London season, a glittering affair where political alliances were forged and reputations were made or broken under the light of 1,000 candles. When the invitation arrived at Mournfield, Sarah had assumed they would send their regrets. The Duke had not attended a society event in 10 years. "We will attend," Alistair had stated, not as a question, but as a fact. It is time they met my Duchess. The night of the ball, Sarah stood before the mirror in her dressing room, a stranger to herself. The gown Alistair had commissioned for her from a London modiste was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk, simple in its lines but exquisitely cut, the color of the sky just after the last light has faded. Her mask was a delicate creation of silver filigree that left her eyes and mouth bare. Mary, her maid, clasped a necklace of sapphires and diamonds around her neck, the Mournfield jewels, which had lain in a vault for a decade. "Oh, my lady," Mary breathed. "You look—" She seemed at a loss for words. When Sarah descended the stairs, Alistair was waiting in the great hall. He was not in his usual severe black, but in formal evening attire, a mask of polished ebony held in his hand. He stopped speaking to his steward and simply watched her approach. The look in his eyes held more warmth and admiration than 1,000 pretty compliments. The ballroom was a dizzying kaleidoscope of color, sound, and perfume. Whispers followed them as they entered. The notorious reclusive Duke of Mournfield and his unknown, unheralded Duchess. Sarah felt a tremor of her old insecurity, but Alistair's hand was a firm, reassuring presence at the small of her back. She was not the penniless Sarah Prescott anymore. She was the Duchess of Mournfield, and she was at her husband's side. They were soon surrounded. Peers of the realm, who had once given Alistair a wide berth, now approached with cautious curiosity. Sarah found, to her surprise, that she was not intimidated. She spoke with an earl about land management, correcting him on a point about crop rotation with a quiet authority that left him blinking. She discussed investments with a banker, her grasp of figures sharp and undeniable. She was not performing. She was simply being herself. The whispers began to change. They were no longer about the Duke's strange, quiet bride, but about the Duchess's startling intelligence. Late in the evening, they were approached by Sir Reginald Croft. He was with a group of his cronies, his face flushed with wine and malice. He clearly saw this as his opportunity for revenge. "Your Grace," he said to Sarah with a theatrical bow, his voice loud enough for all around them to hear. "I see you have adjusted to your gilded cage. Tell me, does the Duke allow you to handle the household accounts? It must feel so very familiar to you, poring over ledgers." The implication was clear. She was a glorified housekeeper, a servant elevated beyond her station. A hush fell over the group. This was the moment of public humiliation he had craved. Sarah felt a flash of cold anger, but before she could respond, Alistair stepped forward slightly, drawing every eye. He did not address Sir Reginald at all. He looked at the Earl with whom Sarah had been speaking earlier. "Lord Ashworth," Alistair said, his voice calm and carrying. "You were asking earlier about the recent improvements to my northern holdings. You should direct your questions to my wife. It was her strategic renegotiation of the tenant leases and her plan for timber management that increased the estate's yield by 20% in a single quarter." He then turned his gaze, which was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice, upon Sir Reginald. "Some men see value only in a pretty face or a fat purse. They are blind to true assets." He paused, letting the words sink in. My Duchess is the greatest asset Mournfield has ever had. It was a public validation, a naming of her worth in front of the very society that had dismissed her. It was not a rescue, it was an endorsement. Sir Reginald's face went pale, then mottled with fury. He had been exposed as a fool, his judgment questioned, his pettiness laid bare. He sputtered, but no one was listening. The crowd's attention had shifted entirely to Sarah, their expressions a mixture of surprise, reassessment, and newfound respect. Lord Ashworth cleared his throat. "Indeed," he said, looking at Sarah with genuine admiration. "Duchess, perhaps you would enlighten me about that timber plan." The moment was over. Sir Reginald had been vanquished, not with a sword, but with a simple public statement of fact. Later, as they were leaving the ball, Alistair took her hand. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked. And Sarah, looking at his face, knew that the fortress of Mournfield was no longer a cage or a prison. It was home. The garden at Mournfield was in full, riotous bloom. The roses Sarah had so carefully pruned and staked now climbed the old stone walls, their blossoms a profusion of crimson, pink, and ivory. The pathways were clear, lined with lavender and thyme, and the air was sweet with the scent of honeysuckle. It was a place reborn, a testament to patience and steady work. Sarah stood on the terrace, a cup of morning coffee in her hands, watching the sun burn the mist off the lawns. A year had passed since the ball in London, a year of quiet, settled peace. Alistair came to stand beside her, placing his own cup on the stone balustrade and draping an arm around her shoulders. She leaned into his warmth, a familiar, comforting weight. Their life had found its rhythm, a shared cadence of work and quiet companionship. The library was still their sanctuary, but now the silences were easy, punctuated by shared smiles and quiet conversation. The long dining table had been replaced by a small, round one where they sat side by side, their knees sometimes brushing. Mournfield was no longer a silent, echoing fortress. It was filled with the low murmur of a happy staff, the scent of baking from the kitchens, and frequently the sound of Sarah's laughter, which was no longer a rare and private thing. "Peterson believes the climbing rose on the west wall may reach the roof by next summer," she said, gesturing with her cup. "He is insufferably proud." "He has a right to be," Alistair said, his gaze on the garden. "As do you. You brought this place back to life." "I had help," she murmured. He turned to look at her, his gray eyes soft. "This was never about the garden, was it?" She knew what he meant. The restoration of the overgrown grounds had mirrored their own slow, careful cultivation of trust and affection. What had begun as a cold, practical contract had blossomed into something rich and true. What was broken had been made whole. What was discarded had become essential. "I love you, Alistair," she said, the words as simple and natural as breathing. "I know," he replied, his thumb stroking her arm. "It is a fact I have come to rely on, like the sunrise." He bent and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that tasted of coffee and the sweet morning air. It was a kiss that held no reservations, no lingering shadows of the past, only the quiet, certain promise of their future. He rested his forehead against hers, his hand coming to rest on her stomach, where the first stirrings of a new life, the air their contract had demanded, were just beginning to make themselves known. It was no longer a contractual obligation, but a joyful continuation of the love they had built. They stood together in the morning sun, hands linked, two people who had found each other through the coldest of transactions, only to discover the deepest warmth. They were home, in a garden they had restored together, Thank you for joining us for this story. We hope it brought a little warmth to your day. Would you have trusted the Duke after discovering his secret? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Remember, the best alliances often begin as the most honest transactions.